Happy Valentine's Day to everyone. I'm just going to wait a few more minutes for some more people to join us tonight. I'm so happy you could be with me here with Mrs. Q Live from 18th century New York City. Tonight we're going to be talking about some great romances of the Revolutionary War. Some started a little bit before the Revolutionary War, but the couples are still important when we get to the Revolutionary War. And we're going to talk about one couple after the Revolutionary War because their parents were so important. So that Revolutionary War period, for Valentine's Day, we're going to play tribute to some of what we might call the power couples of the I guess middle to late 18th century. So thank you so much. I think I can see your messages. If you want to send me a message on Facebook or YouTube in the comments, they should pop up right here and I can see them. So if you have any questions as I go along or any comments, I'll be happy to answer them for you. So I'm going to wait just another few seconds for some more people to join us. Oh, we have some people. Hello. It's nice to see all of you tonight. I hope you're all going to do something fun tomorrow for Valentine's Day. I'm wondering if Mr. Q will have a Valentine for me. And maybe tonight I'll talk about how Mr. Q and I met, not the 21st century Mr. Q and I, but the 18th century Mr. Q and I, because as soon as we get underway here, we are going to be in the 18th century and I won't be talking about my modern self much anymore. So I'm very glad for those of you who can join me. For those of you in Northeastern Pennsylvania, I am going to be doing some things here in Northeastern Pennsylvania this spring, summer, and fall. So I hope you'll follow me here on YouTube and on other social media, Instagram or Facebook, to know more about ways you can come out to see me live. And I also am working on a walking tour of the great city of Philadelphia. Mrs. Q goes to Philadelphia with my good friend Kyle Jenks, who plays James Madison. So Mr. Madison and Mrs. Q will be walking you through the city of Philadelphia, I hope this summer. So we'll get working on that soon. So it's the 18th century, it's Valentine's Day, and let's talk a little bit about romance and finding your best love in the 18th century. Some marriages, of course, were arranged between powerful families, but in general, in the American colonies, people fell in love. They spent time together. They fell in love. They decided to marry. They got married and had a family and stayed together. Someone who came from England even remarked at how horrified he was that young men and young women were choosing their own mates for life. So that was a pretty surprising thing that started happening here in the American colonies. Now, Mr. Q, oh yeah, I have a message from someone. Oh, someone discovered me on RBN. I'm a great teacher and historian. Thank you so much. For those of you who don't know, on Sunday nights at 9 o'clock, I do an American history show on republicbroadcastingnetwork.org. You can find them on the internet. And I'm there every Friday night at 9 p.m. My modern self talking about the past. So for those of you who are joining from RBN, thank you for listening to me there. For those of you who don't know about it, you might want to check it out. This Sunday is a little bit different of a subject or a show that we're going to be doing, but the Sunday after, I'll be back to just doing the American Revolution. So here's a bunch of people saying hello to all of you as well. So in the 18th century, people generally choose their husbands and wives, but they're going to choose largely among their own peers in their own class, except for one match we're going to talk about tonight, who you may know who they are, and the gentleman very much married up when he married his wife. So Mr. Q and I met when we were children as part of the same social set. And generally the kids or children who socialize in these social sets do go on to find their mates in those sets and are usually expected to marry someone within their friendship circle. Now, it was quite interesting to me that Mr. Q chose to be with me because none of the boys really liked me very much, or at least none of them wanted to be married to me. The boys liked me very much when we were out doing boys things, but there got to be a point as I was growing up that the boys were not so fond of spending time with me anymore. They all wanted to be with boys, and I still was good at boys things. I still wanted to go out at night and look at the heavens and identify the constellations. I still wanted to do science. I still wanted to do math. I was, of course, helping out in my father's shop, already learning to keep ledgers, to keep inventory. And I really was not interested in spending time with the girls like my sister was. But the boys were not interested in spending time with a girl, right? After about 10 or 11 years old, the boys really don't want to be with girls anymore. So I became a little bit of an outcast, a little bit rejected, and started spending most of my time in my father's library or traveling with my father and running his merchant business. And that was most of my growing up time. Mr. Q traveled with his father, who was a fur trader, which Mr. Q became himself, and eventually decided that he thought it was rather wonderful that I liked math and I liked to gaze at the stars and I liked science and I liked botany and anatomy and all these things boys liked. And he decided that I would make him quite a good wife and asked my father for my hand. My father, of course, agreed. I think my mother and father were just happy that someone wanted me at that point, because as some of you might know, my sister married into the very wealthy Van Rensselaer family and married very well as a result of her fine manners and upbringing. Not that I didn't have the same upbringing, and I did go to a girls' etiquette and finishing school. I didn't do as well as my sister, but I mastered most of it okay. But Mr. Q proposed to me. My father said yes. I said yes. And that was our story. And we've had a very good relationship in that he appreciates my intellectual curiosity, my mastery of many subjects. And I, of course, appreciate his intellect and abilities as well. So we've had a very good relationship. Now, one of the relationships that Mr. Q and I have based ours on is the first power couple we're going to talk about tonight. And they are, come over here and find them. They are Mr. and Mrs. James Alexander, or Mary Spratt Prevost Alexander and James Alexander. And I'm just going to pop up some notes here because I don't always remember everything about these two because they're somewhat in the past, even for me. Now, Mary Spratt and James Alexander were married in 1721, so quite a bit before I was born. But Mrs. Alexander would turn out to be a friend of my father's and a mentor to me, and that she was one of the most successful merchants here in the city of New York. She was born into a wealthy and successful merchant family. Her grandmother, I have to check her name. I always forget her grandmother's name. Her maternal grandmother was Cornelia de Peyster. You may know the de Peyster family from early New Amsterdam, early New York. She was raised by her maternal grandmother, Mrs. de Peyster, and Mrs. de Peyster at that time was the wealthiest lady, maybe the wealthiest person in New York, running her family's mercantile business. And this is where Mrs. Alexander learned this business herself. Well, Mrs. Alexander married Mr. Spratt for some time, who was also a merchant. Oh, I'm sorry. She married Samuel Prevost. She has a long name, Mary Spratt Prevost Alexander. So she's born Mary Spratt. She marries Samuel Prevost, who also is a merchant, dry goods importer, and a real estate agent. And under her stewardship, his business blossomed and became much bigger and more successful than it ever was before. Well, he died, and then she married the lawyer, Mr. James Alexander, and continued on running her business. It was said that there wasn't a ship in a dock in New York that didn't have goods meant for one of Mrs. Alexander's shops. The Alexanders lived in a lovely big mansion on Broad Street, and as she was the most prominent lady merchant in New York when I was a small girl, of course, she was a mentor to me and a friend of my father's, as there weren't very many women doing the types of business that she was. These are not seen to be ladylike traits, keeping ledgers, running businesses, negotiating with ship captains, getting on ships, inspecting inventory, dealing with all of these sorts of things are not generally thought of as a lady's pastime or a lady's business, but she was quite good at it. And I learned some from her when I was a very little girl. She always taught me to be confident and not to let the men intimidate me, which is something my father told me as well. And since I traveled so much with my father doing his business, I got to know all of the ship captains and everyone. They all treated me and continue to treat me quite well. It's not always easy for a woman in these sorts of men's traditional businesses. So now her husband, James Alexander, was one of the finest lawyers in all of New York City. And in your time, you might know him for a very famous case he was involved in. It was the libel case of the printer John Peter Zenger, which occurred in 1735. Mr. Zenger's libel case, he had a newspaper called the New York Weekly Journal, changed the libel laws in the city of New York. Now, Mr. Alexander and his partner, Mr. Smith, were disbarred in the course of this trial, and it was Mrs. Alexander who went to Philadelphia to retrieve the great Andrew Hamilton, who came to New York and defended Mr. Zenger. And in the course of that, the libel law in New York was changed to guarantee a free press. So in 1735, the city of New York got the free press with the help of Mr. and Mrs. Alexander, some other lawyers, John Peter Zenger, and that has continued through to my time, a right very much cherished here in the city of New York. So Mr. and Mrs. Alexander. Also, I should mention that their son, William Alexander, the Earl of Stirling, went on to be a general in the Revolutionary War. And how he becomes the Earl of Stirling is a story for another time, which I will tell one night. Perhaps we'll just talk about Revolutionary War officers and who they were and what they did. And in that case, we'll talk about Lord Stirling, as he was called. So Mr. and Mrs. Alexander, our first Valentine power couple of the 18th century. Let's see who's next on our list. Oh, some of you might, I'm surely recognize these two. Not from New York, but noted for all that they did. Very important couple, Mercy Otis Warren and her husband, James Warren, from Massachusetts, from just outside of Boston. Mercy Otis and James Warren were married in 1754. So for those of you kind of not sure about dates here, that's about 20 years before the American Revolution. And she had the unusual upbringing of being allowed to be educated with her brothers, Joseph and James, as they were being prepared for college. So Miss Warren learned all of the subjects that boys at that time learned. Her father must have been a rather interesting gentleman to allow this. Her father was a lawyer and sat in the Massachusetts Assembly, as would her husband, James Warren, who was a businessman, a gentleman farmer, and also sat in the Massachusetts Assembly. Mrs. Warren, by the way, went on to have 5 sons, and throughout their lives, Mr. and Mrs. Warren had a very lovely, loving and respectful relationship, wrote wonderful loving letters to each other, and had an incredible intellectual and emotional bond. Now, Mrs. Warren and Mr. Warren, at the time of what you might recall was the Stamp Act in the 1760s, began allowing rebels to meet in their home to talk about resisting the Stamp Act. And it was her brother, the lawyer James Otis, who gave the famous speech in the Massachusetts Assembly that taxation without representation was tyranny. So that was her brother. He was a Harvard-educated lawyer. They allowed rebels to meet in their home. They helped form a committee of correspondence. They allowed the Sons of Liberty to meet in their home. And they also helped unite people not only for the Stamp Act, but the Quartering Act, and later against the Tea Act. Mrs. Warren became a writer, and she had something very interesting to say about standing up against England, because both she and her husband, of course, will become advocates of us separating from the crown. And she said, America stands armed with resolution and virtue, but she still recoils at the idea of drawing the sword against the nation from whom she derived her origin. Yet Britain, like an unnatural parent, is ready to plunge her dagger into the bosom of her affectionate offspring. In other words, we, the children of Britain, are reticent to raise our hand against them, yet they are ready to plunge a dagger into our hearts. A very radical thing for a lady to say, don't you think? So she was highly revered for her writing. After the American Revolution, she wrote a history of the rise, progress, and termination of the American Revolution. It's 3 volumes. Thomas Jefferson said it was the finest recollection of the American Revolutionary War, and he bought copies not only for himself, but for all the members of his cabinet. So we have James and Mercy Otis Warren, who we might say are one of our parent couples of the American Revolution, aren't they? Married in 1754. And now we'll get into more the Revolutionary War era. And who do we have next but this beautiful woman and her husband? And this is Sarah Livingston and John Jay. Sarah Livingston and John Jay were married in 1774, so just before the outbreak of the American Revolution, right? The American Revolution will begin with Lexington and Concord the following year with 1775. So 1774, they're married, and altogether they will have 6 children. 3 of them will be born abroad. In 1779, they moved to Spain. John Jay was a King's College educated lawyer, and Sarah Livingston's father, William Livingston, was a very renowned lawyer as well. He went to Yale. John Jay went to King's College, which I think in your time you know as Columbia University. He was chosen to be an ambassador to Spain and France during the war, and in 1779, they both moved to Spain, where Mrs. Jay became quite important in the diplomatic service, as it became known as they were in Europe that it very much was the ladies and the wives who were the key to meeting the right people and organizing the right events in order to move ideas through, financing, make alliances, politics, things like that. And Mrs. Jay was extraordinary at this. Mrs. Jay was also a very well-educated woman, and that Mr. Livingston educated all of his children, his sons and his daughters. She spoke fluent French. She probably learned to speak Spanish while she was there. She had, as you can see from the painting, perfect, lovely couture and manners, and really became the cornerstone of Mr. Jay's successful diplomatic career. She even received a visitor in Spain in her private chambers, like we're in mine tonight, because she was sick with morning sickness while she was expecting, but not wanting to miss this important meeting with this diplomat, she had him brought into her private chambers for their meeting. So even having morning sickness did not stop Mrs. Jay from her diplomatic efforts. She had 2 children born in Spain and then 1 born later in Paris. Now they moved on to Paris, and while in Paris, Mr. and Mrs. Jay became a part of the Paris evening social life, understanding that that again would be key to his diplomatic success and forming ties between America and France. She was very successful in French society, and those friendships later would become crucial in negotiating things like the final Treaty of Paris with the British, and then other diplomatic things that occurred after the Revolutionary War. In the theater one night, Mrs. Jay was actually mistaken for Queen Marie Antoinette. She was up in a balcony in a private box, and someone looked up, began to applaud, and the audience stood and applauded her as if she was Marie Antoinette. So lovely, Mr. and Mrs. John Jay. After the Revolutionary War, you might know Mr. Jay became the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the capital city at that time was New York City. Mrs. Jay was the unquestioned queen of New York City society. She was the lady to know. It was her dinners where many international diplomatic arrangements were made, where many arrangements within our own government were made. She had the list of who was who and knew who to invite with which events. She arranged dinners and banquets to put the right people together at the right time. Mr. Jay went on to serve as governor of New York. She became the first lady of New York, and later he retired, and in 1801, he built a farm that he called the John Jay Homestead, and that's in today's Katona, New York. It is still there. You can visit it in your time if you'd like. Unfortunately for Mr. Jay, the next year, the love of his life, Sarah Livingston Jay, died. Jay was highly despondent, first at the loss of his wife, but also because all of their life had been spent together, furthering either his career or the success of the United States of America, our nation, and that now that they finally had time to enjoy only to themselves, she was gone. It's a wonderful place to visit if you're in the New York or Hudson Valley area. the John Jay Homestead. I highly recommend that you go. So who is our next couple? Some of you might not be so happy to see our next couple. Let's see who they are. Oh my goodness. I think you know these two. Is that Miss Margaret Peggy Shippen and Benedict Arnold? Indeed, it is. I know many of you might not be too happy in seeing the faces of these two, but undeniably, they were both incredibly important people during the Revolutionary War. Now, they married in 1779. Excuse me, Miss Shippen was only 19 years old, while Mr. Arnold was 38. There was a 20-year difference between them, and he had been married previously, and by that time had children who were almost grown. They met in Philadelphia during the American military occupation of Philadelphia when he was serving there. Miss Shippen came from what was originally a largely loyalist family. Her father, Edward Shippen, very prominent merchant in the Philadelphia area. Prior to that, the city was occupied by the British, and Miss Shippen had a number of suitors among the British officers. It is rumored that Major John Andre was one of those suitors, but there are others who say no, it was just a friendship. Either way, she was out in society. She was determined to be the most beautiful young lady in all of society in America. It was someone who met her later in life, I think after they went to England, remarked that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. And that's likely just flattery, I think, because there were plenty of young ladies here in America during that time who were quite attractive as well. But Miss Shippen, of course, had someone to promote her. She had someone to style her hair, style her clothes. She came from great wealth and wound up marrying General Benedict Arnold. Now, you might know what happens with them. They get married, they have a child. Benedict Arnold, General Arnold, is put into command of West Point, and he takes up a communication with the head of British intelligence, that same major that Miss Shippen knew in Philadelphia, John Andre. And he and Major Andre take up a correspondence, and it is decided that General Arnold is going to switch sides. Right? You know the story. He's going to switch sides to the British side, and in so doing, he's also going to help them take the prize they have sought since 1776. For 4 years, the prize the British have not attained, and that is West Point, the fort at West Point, and command of the Middle Hudson River, right? They have the southern end of the Hudson and the upper end of the Hudson, but they do not have control of that middle section of the Hudson River. So it is decided that Benedict Arnold will give them that. He'll help them take over West Point, and he will go over to the other side and command for them. And you probably know this whole scheme goes terribly wrong when Major Andre goes to meet with General Arnold, and he is captured. Well, Major Andre is hanged for this whole escapade, but the Arnolds make their way down to still British-occupied New York City, where they live for the remainder of the war, and then move to England, where they spend the rest of their lives together. So like them or not, they are still a very important couple of their time. I know there are rumors that Mrs. Arnold was in some way involved with Major Andre and her husband's decision, although I have to say that the gentlemen I know all reject that notion that she was involved in any way. And of course, we will never know. So Mr. and Mrs. Benedict Arnold. Let's see who is next. I think you know the next couple as well. And they just might be our, next to the Jays, our next most power couple of the era. And there they are, Mr. and Mrs. Alexander Hamilton, Miss Elizabeth Schuyler and Mr. Alexander Hamilton. And this is my favorite portrait of Mrs. Hamilton, a beautiful portrait of her. And they're married in 1780. So this is right during the war. Hamilton is a young officer. Miss Schuyler, of course, is living in New York with her family. And in the summer of 1780, this is just before the wars finished, right? Be finished the next year. Her aunt has a party in Morristown, New Jersey, and young officer Alexander Hamilton is present at that party. And of course, they like each other. They fall in love, they court, and eventually they marry. Now, what's very interesting about this marriage, a number of things interesting about this marriage. One of them is that my sister has married into the Van Rensselaer family, and Mrs. Hamilton's mother is a Van Rensselaer. So my sister, in an odd way, is related by marriage to Mr. Hamilton now. Very odd thing. Anyway, Mr. Hamilton comes from no name, no money, no background, other than being on George Washington's staff, General Washington's staff. He really truly is a nobody. He didn't even finish his studies at King's College. Yet here we have Miss Schuyler, who is a descendant of Hudson River aristocracy on both sides. On her father, Philip Schuyler's side, on her mother, Catherine Van Rensselaer's side. So it's a very unusual match, isn't it? And to make it even more unusual, it is the only marriage among all of her sisters that her parents approved of. All of her sisters eloped with gentlemen the parents disapproved of, but they liked Mr. Hamilton, and they were married in the Schuyler Mansion in Albany, New York, at the end of 1780, so only a few months after they met. By all accounts, they have a lovely relationship. She might be, well, she's certainly more cultured than he is. You know, she speaks fluent French and she reads and writes French. I know that Mr. Hamilton knows some French, but the extent of his reading and writing I'm not familiar with. She's very well educated, as the Schuylers also educated their daughters, and she has wonderful, excellent manners. Now, an interesting thing happens here in New York, in society, with the Hamiltons. They get married during the war, they live in Albany for a time, and then they move back to New York at the end of the war. And this odd thing begins to happen because we have people here in New York, I have to tell you, who do not like Mr. Hamilton at all, who really intensely dislike Mr. Hamilton, but they adore Mrs. Hamilton. They adore Betsy Schuyler. She's a wonderful lady. She's been liked all of her life. She's a wonderful mother. She's a lovely hostess. There isn't anyone who can find a terrible thing to say about her. And we find odd social events where people will walk they'll briefly say hello to Mr. Hamilton because they must, walk past him, and then spend their time conversing instead with Mrs. Hamilton. And did you hear about what Mr. Burr said about Mrs. Hamilton? I don't know if you know in your time, but in our time, we ladies are generally always known by the most powerful man we're related to. So when I was growing up, I was Mr. C's daughter. I wasn't Mrs. C's daughter, I was Mr. C's daughter. And now that I'm married, I'm Mr. Q's wife. Although, I'll tell you a secret, there are people here in New York who say that Mr. Q is Mrs. Q's husband, but we won't talk about that. It's a rather scandalous thing. But I'm generally known as Mr. Q's wife. If he were to die, I would be a widow and I would be my son's mother. So always with respect to whoever the closest male relative is to you. Now, Mr. Burr said that Mrs. Hamilton never needed to be the daughter of Mr. Schuyler or the wife of Mr. Hamilton to earn the respect she had. He said she's a great lady in her own right and didn't need to be associated with any of the gentlemen to earn the respect she has. Now, that is quite a radical thing to say, isn't it? That a lady has earned her respect completely in her own right, not dependent on any man in her family at all. So Mr. Burr might be a rather radical gentleman, and we'll be getting onto him in a few minutes. Even Mr. Burr just adores Mrs. Hamilton. Now, together, Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton had, in their lifetime, 8 children. Probably know their oldest son, Philip, is named for her father. He's a graduate of King's College, and sadly, in 1801, he will be lost to them in a duel. Terrible duel, at which time his sister, the oldest daughter, Angelica, begins to suffer mental deterioration. You may know, of course, that 3 years later, Mr. Hamilton will be killed in a duel with Mr. Burr, at which point daughter Angelica is no longer able to function at all, and she will need lifetime care. Now, Mrs. Hamilton is going to be left with all of those children to raise. There are 7 left, and also quite a lot of financial burden to deal with in her lifetime. She is a strong, respectable, and incredible woman, and she will live to be 96 years old. She is going to live for 50 years after Mr. Hamilton dies in the duel. She will never remarry, and she will remain true to him all that time. So she'll live without him more years than she was alive when he died. What kind of dedication and love is that? A wonderful woman. Now, I have a note here to talk about something that's a little bit unseemly, but people generally ask me about it, and that is the pamphlet that Mr. Hamilton wrote about the Reynolds affair. And that was when he was in the government in Philadelphia, when he was Treasury Secretary. The government moved on from New York after 1 year to Philadelphia, where it remained for some long time. And during that time, he entered into a romantic affair with a young woman named Maria Reynolds. He also gave her money during that time. Well, unfortunately for Mr. Hamilton, it turned out that Miss Reynolds was Mrs. Reynolds, and that she and her husband were criminals and were extorting him. It took quite a few years for this to come out in the public. Mrs. Schuyler heard rumors about it, and Mrs. Hamilton heard rumors about it, and she rejected it for many years until Mr. Hamilton in 1797 wrote a pamphlet addressing the affair because he had been accused of financial misappropriations in his role as Treasury Secretary. In order to clear his name in that respect, he wrote a pamphlet all about the affair. This upset Mrs. Hamilton greatly, as you can imagine, as well as it upset her sister, her family, and many ladies in this town that he did that, and she left him temporarily. At that time, she was expecting. She left. She went back to her family in Albany, where she bore their 6th child, a son. And they later were able to reconcile, but a very difficult time for her, very embarrassing time for her, because of course the pamphlet was everywhere and everyone read it. And it was a really terrible period for her to have to endure. And I think most of us all felt sympathy for her for what she'd gone through, except of course there are always a few evil people who laugh and make fun of people like that. But our hearts all went out to Mrs. Hamilton during that trying time. So after Mr. and Mrs. Jay, our second most powerful couple in the capital city, Mr. and Mrs. Alexander Hamilton. Now, I know some of you probably just thought, what about Mr. and Mrs. Washington? Not so. The 3 couples who were the most important in society when the capital city was here was Mr. and Mrs. Jay in the first position, and then in the second position, Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton, and Mr. and Mrs. Henry Knox. Mr. Knox was the Secretary of War at that time. And those were the 3 ladies who really ran society at that time, and the 3 couples who were the most powerful socially. It's just some interesting society from the time. So happy Valentine's Day to Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton. And unfortunately for the next couple, we only have a portrait of him because there is no surviving portrait of Mrs. Burr. So this is Mr. Aaron Burr, and our next couple, of course, will be Theodosia Bartow Prevost and Aaron Burr, who are married in 1780 at the Hermitage in New Jersey. Married 1782. They meet the year 1780, the same year that Mr. Hamilton met Miss Schuyler, and they meet in a similar way at a party. This party instead is at Mrs. Prevost's home, the Hermitage. Now, Mrs. Prevost at this time is 10 years older than Mr. Burr. He's a colonel in the American Army. Her husband is a major in the British Army, and she has 5 children. Mrs. Prevost is a brilliant lady. She speaks French, she reads and writes French, she's educated in the classics, she's educated in philosophy and art, literature, the sciences. And when Mr. Burr, I should say then Colonel Burr, meets her, he cannot believe what he is seeing. Mr. Burr said that throughout all of his life, since he was a little boy, he always assumed that just like there were a few men capable of the greatest intellectual achievements, there were a few ladies who were as well. But he said he never met them, and he thought that at first he thought it was because of our educational lacking here for young women. But he said as the years went by and he met none, he started believing that was just a young boy's fantasy. He said, until I met you, to his wife. And then he realized that there were women capable of great intellectual achievements. He said that she was his intellectual equal, something that Mr. Burr did not say easily. Let me assure you that is not something Mr. Burr said easily about anyone. And his moral superior, so his intellectual equal and his moral superior. Now, luckily for Mr. Burr, who is spending quite a lot of time at the Hermitage, even though Madame Prevost is still Mrs. Prevost, Major Prevost will be killed in the Revolutionary War, and she becomes a widow. In 1782, they are married, and Mr. Burr adopts all 5 of her children as his own. He raises them all as his sons. The 2 oldest are boys. The oldest son will go on to become a clerk in Mr. Burr's law firm and become a judge in the state of Louisiana later. The second son will be educated as well, and he will become a gentleman farmer in Pelham, New York. There are 3 girls who all go on to marry, and of course, together, Mr. and Mrs. Burr will have 2 daughters, one who dies when she's a toddler, but the other who would live on, and that is Theodosia Burr Alston. Mr. and Mrs. Burr set out to prove that a lady can achieve the same intellectual achievements as a man and still be fully a lady. In order to do that, they will educate their daughter as a firstborn son. So she, at a very young age, begins to read and write, I think 3. By 5, she can already write simple letters to her father. At 8, she begins learning Latin and Greek. She's already speaking French. Her mother starts speaking French with her when she's a very little girl. She's studying math. She's studying sciences, studying literature, studying everything the boys study with the same tutors who tutor the boys. And Mr. Burr expects her to make the same progress as the boys her age. Luckily for her, she has a wonderful mother who also sees the value of recreation and relaxation and getting her mind off of her studies. When Miss Burr is only 11 years old, Mrs. Burr dies of stomach cancer, leaving her, of course, heartbroken. Aaron Burr heartbroken as well. And now Mr. Burr becomes a single father. He is going to hire a French governess to help care for young Theodosia. He also adopts a young woman, Theodosia's age, who was born in the Palace of Versailles and whose mother sent her to America to escape the French Revolution and the French Terror. Her name is Miss Delage. Miss Delage and Miss Burr will grow up as sisters. Miss Burr will be fully immersed in French society as a result, and she goes on to study the subjects at Princeton. Did I forget to tell you that Mr. Burr's father was the founder of Princeton College and that Mr. Burr himself was a graduate? Miss Burr could not attend, but Mr. Burr hired the teachers there to come to New York to educate his daughter. And she would become the first fully educated woman in American history to be educated by the same educators who educated the boys. Mr. Burr was very smart about this, and that he knew that if she was educated only by women, people would reject her education as not being rigorous enough. So he made sure that she was educated with the same teachers who educated the men. Wonderful, isn't it? And by all accounts, she became a wonderful young woman, brilliant like her father, but sociable and mannerly like her mother, and became quite, shall I say, the prize for any young man here in the city of New York, sought after by some of the gentlemen of the best families here in the city of New York. Although she will not marry someone from New York, we'll go on to talk about who she marries in a few minutes. So to Mr. and Mrs. Aaron Burr, who gave us in America the first fully educated woman, or as she is called, the first gentlewoman of her time, a lady who could sit at the head of a table at a state dinner, conduct all of the serious conversation while still making light conversation and being perfectly ladylike as well. The first gentlewoman, Miss Theodosia Burr, who goes on to be Mrs. Joseph Austen. So happy Valentine's Day, Mr. and Mrs. Burr. And let's see who's next. Well, you might not know these two. Some of you might know, if you really are interested in that spiring called the Culper spiring, you might know that this gentleman is Benjamin Talmadge, and the lady is his wife, Mary Floyd. And they were both from, of course, the North Shore of Long Island. Benjamin Talmadge was a colonel in the Revolutionary War and the leader of that Culper spiring, which is so famous in your time. A brilliant man, one of Washington's most favorites, and after the war, marries someone he grew up with, Mary Floyd. Mary Floyd is not just any young lady. Mary Floyd's father, William Floyd, signed the Declaration of Independence from Long Island. And these are two beautiful portraits of them, I think by Gilbert Stuart. Most of the portraits I've shown you tonight are from some of the greatest painters of that time. Benjamin Talmadge with one of their sons, and Mary Floyd Talmadge with a son and a daughter. Lovely paintings, Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Talmadge. Certainly the power couple from the North Shore of Long Island after the Revolutionary War. They did live in Connecticut, and Mr. Talmadge went on to become Congressman Talmadge later. So a very successful and lovely couple. Happy Valentine's Day to Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Talmadge. And our final couple, who is a post-Revolutionary War couple, but important because of who her parents were. And this is Theodosia Burr and John Alston. And this is the young man, Theodosia Burr, decided to marry John Alston of South Carolina. The portrait of Theodosia Burr was done by John Vanderlyn, and it is her wedding portrait. They were married in 1801, just a few weeks before Mr. Burr took his oath of office as vice president of the United States of America, right? Thomas Jefferson was president and Mr. Burr became vice president. So just a few weeks before that in 1801. This young couple met on a political tour in 1800. Mr. Burr took his daughter Theodosia on a tour of New England as he traveled throughout New England to advocate for the election of Thomas Jefferson. You might recall that the New Englanders were not fond of Mr. Jefferson, calling him a heathen and an atheist and even a demon. So Mr. Burr went on a trip throughout New England, which was his own family roots, where he was very well respected. Did I also forget to mention that Mr. Burr's grandfather was the great Pastor Jonathan Edwards? So Theodosia Burr's great-grandfather was the great Jonathan Edwards. Her grandfather was Aaron Burr Sr., the founder of Princeton, and of course her father, Vice President Aaron Burr. So he was very popular in New England, and to make himself even more of a, I'm going to say, a draw, he brought his beautiful, educated daughter with him. And they were quite a sensation traveling that year in 1800, advocating on behalf of Thomas Jefferson. Well, also on that trip from South Carolina was Joseph Alston, John Alston. I confuse my Jims, Joseph, and Johns all the time. Please excuse me, all those J names. James, John Jay had a brother, James Jay, and I confuse them, and I confuse all of these names. Actually, this is Joseph Alston. So Theodosia and Mr. Alston meet on this trip. Mr. Alston is also a graduate of Princeton. He served as a lawyer and was taught by the great Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, a great lawyer and patriot, but decided he didn't like the life of a lawyer and went on to resurrect his father's failing rice plantation, turning it into one of the largest and most successful rice plantations in America. After the trip, he proposed to Theodosia, who was only 17 at the time, and she wrote to him that they were too young to get married, that Aristotle wrote that young people shouldn't get married until they were in their mid-20s at least. And why does he know better than Aristotle knew? And a friend said that at that point, Mr. Alston should have turned and run away as fast as he was able. But instead, he was up to the challenge and wrote her a wonderful 4-page letter advocating for himself and for how lovely South Carolina was. Mr. Burr was quite amused by that letter and gave his permission for her hand. And she accepted the proposal, and they were married, as I said, in 1801, just a few weeks before her father was sworn in as vice president. The next year, she had a baby son, Aaron Burr Alston, and 10 years later, young Aaron Burr Alston died of malaria. Now, the Alstons could have no other children, as Theodosia was only able to have him. By that time, Mr. Alston had risen through South Carolina politics incredibly fast and was already the governor of South Carolina. Many people attribute his successful political career to her advising him, as she was right with her mother when her mother was advising her father on his senatorial career. So many people give her the credit for his quick rise through South Carolina politics. Well, at that time, Mrs. Alston became, as you could imagine, losing her only child, inconsolably depressed. So Mr. Alston hired a schooner to bring her to New York. She often spent part of the year in New York with their son, and he thought a trip to New York to see her father and friends would cheer her up. And the schooner never made it to its destination, and Mrs. Alston was never seen again. She was just short of her 30th birthday, Theodosia Burr Alston, lost at sea. Mr. Alston was so inconsolable at the loss of his wife that he stopped caring for himself, and he died himself 4 years later of illness. Mr. Burr, of course, now was a lost man, having lost his wife, he said, the finest lady, greatest woman he had ever known, and his daughter, into whom he poured his intellect, his spirit, his everything to make her an exceptional lady. He lost her as well. So very sad for Mr. Burr. So happy Valentine's Day to this wonderful young couple, Theodosia Burr and Joseph Alston. Someone said, someone is very happy that I mentioned Benjamin Talmadge and Mary Floyd. Mira, thank you. I'm glad that you're happy about that, because they were a wonderful couple, Benjamin Talmadge and Mary Floyd. Mary Floyd's father, of course, being a fugitive, wasn't he? Because he signed the Declaration of Independence. So he had to very carefully guard that he wasn't executed during the Revolutionary War, captured by the British. So a great triumph for both families, the Talmadge and Floyd families. So thank all of you for joining me tonight for a little Revolutionary War era Valentine's tribute to these wonderful couples. I hope you'll join me again next week. I'm not sure what we'll be talking about, but if you have an idea of what you'd like me to talk about, please put it in the comments and I'll take a look. Any subject that covers the middle to late 18th century or early 19th century, let's say up to about 1812. So let's say 1700 to 1812, and I'll be happy to talk about it because, of course, even though I wasn't alive yet in the early 18th century, of course, my father and mother were able to clue me in on some of the things that went on at that time. So thank you very much again. I'm hoping to get a nice Valentine from Mr. Q. He never forgets. He's wonderful, Mr. Q. I'm always happy to him for having chosen me as his wife. So thank you very much. Have a lovely Valentine's Day tomorrow, and I will see you all again next week.